Can you tell us a little bit about how you first became aware of Frank Matsura's story and what made you decide you wanted to do a documentary on it?
Sure. I'm not from the Pacific Northwest originally. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. But kind of a few years into living there, I stopped at the Washington State Historical Museum in Tacoma, Washington. And there was an exhibit of work by the photographer Edward Curtis, and who was famous for taking volumes of photos of Native Americans. And it was called Edward Curtis and His Contemporaries. And when I saw the exhibit, I was kind of going around the room going, oh, that's a Curtis one, obviously. And, beautiful technical photos. Yep, I've seen that. Got it, seen it, and then there were these other photos. And I went, what's that? And they just leapt out at me. And they were some of the photos you saw, like the two young Native women on the fainting couch, and one of a young Native man with a bow tie. And they struck me as having something different going on between the person who was posing in front of the camera and the person who's taking the picture. There just seemed to be a really electric connection there. And so then I read the signage and went, oh, okay, now you got me. That's a Japanese name. What is this man doing out in the middle of nowhere, as people refer to the Okanagan? The people in the Okanagan don't like it when you say it's the middle of nowhere. But it kind of is. So at that point, I went down what I call the Matsura rabbit hole and started trying to figure out who this man was. So.
Awesome. So as a cinematographer, Scott, was there anything that really stuck out to you about his visual storytelling? And is there anything that maybe in his photography influenced how you guys shot the film or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. When Beth came to me with the story, I did grow up in the Northwest, across the mountains from Okanagan, but I hadn't heard his story before. And so looking at his photographs, it allowed me a chance to kind of re-look at the place where I grew up regionally, where I grew up, where I'd traveled, and kind of re-examine my own relationship as a photographer, as a cinematographer, with a sense of place. And then journeying through his story and seeing how he was able to not create a community, but find a community and rebuild and kind of insert himself in that community really impressed me. And all that through this meta concept of him being a photographer and then me getting to photograph that, right? And so it was really fun to kind of re-examine that and then start to look at his work. And what struck me about it was the joy that he brings to it. And, you can be out in the middle of winter in Okanagan and it's a little cold and it's a little hard, but it really brought this joy back to cinematography and back to the interviews, stylistically looking at composition, but really it's about the connection with who you're interviewing and the connection with the content and making sure you're bringing that joy and delivering that to who knows down the line. Matsura doesn't know that we're looking at his, that's not the vision, right? We don't know where that film is going to go. And so just delivering it to the audience down the line.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking of community, Matsura was a Japanese immigrant in America who was photographing and getting along well with Native Americans and white settlers. Frank was very successful at making people comfortable and embedding himself in these communities. Why do you think he was so good at this, and can you kind of just reflect on that as a theme?
There's so little that we have in his own words. And we have newspaper accounts about him in the community that are very favorable generally. The beginning, they were a little who's this guy from Japan here? But overall, he endeared himself to people. But I feel like he had to be wildly charismatic. You just don't walk into these remote communities. And I know that there's this sense in the West that people are coming there to reinvent themselves. So maybe there's a disposition to, we're going to dress up, do weird things together. Nobody back east has to know about this. But he did kind of, engage people in a way that really they were letting their hair down. And I just got to believe that it was the power of his personality, his willingness to put himself out there. and as Scott alluded to, build community. Like he was, as Randy Lewis says in the film, he was bridging these communities very successfully and making connections. Randy remembers, his uncle and some of those other folks hanging around together. That wasn't happening on a regular basis. So.
Yeah. So we had a little segment in there where you guys were with another photographer, and he was kind of explaining the process that he goes through. Mm-hmm. So of course, he had big camera, tripod. We pull out our phones and auto everything.
That's right.
So you can take a picture in like half a second. Yeah. What do you think he would feel of, being able to use some technology like that?
Easy now. I'm really impressed by that, and it's a great question because it's so easy to just do that now. And you have to consider, especially some of those multiplying camera pictures. It's hard to envision. That's a very unusual camera. Not many people worked with that camera, and not many people worked with it the way he did. But he was able to construct these individual frames that are kind of like a photo booth, right? The photo booth goes bam, bam, bam. But every time he took one of those, he had to move these pieces of wood and then somehow get it to look spontaneous on the other side of the camera, that kind of blows my mind. If you think about the time that it took for him to set it up, get behind the camera, get people settled. Okay, now do the funny thing. That's like such... I read later that he almost bought a movie camera, and I would have killed to have seen what he would have shot.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It strikes me as like, someone who would use any technology for the means of, yes, he's a photographer, but what it's really about is the story of the people in front of the camera, his story, and that connection. So I think at any point that he would live, I think he would use whatever technology available to get that story.
That's
Right. There was a brief mention in the documentary about he kept a diary for 2 years.
Right.
Were you guys was it translated? Were you able to read it?
Yeah, it was translated in what is called classical Japanese. So the Japanese language, the way it was written, changed in the time that Matsura, between the time he left and then the time the 1920s, I guess. So it was in classical Japanese, then it was translated into modern Japanese, and then into English. And then, of course, we had to figure out Japanese, it relies heavily on context for things like pronouns. So you're reading it trying to figure out who's he talking about. Well, it was a really interesting process. We spent quite a bit of time on it. The bad thing about the diaries, I will say, is we know stuff about what his daily life was like, but it's not pouring out his soul. Like, we think of diaries like teenage diaries. Oh, my boyfriend broke up with me. and these diaries were like, got up, took a shower, got the kids at the dormitory that he ran to school, taught a class, went on errands. It's not like the stuff of, to use an example, a Ken Burns film, right? It's not one of those classic letters that my darling Sarah, I am dying out in the Civil War battlefield. It's like, yeah, I shaved, So it was a little disappointing that way. But we did find some clues for things that were useful.
Right. So the documentation of like the railroad and the dams, that was just such a great snapshot of that kind of just like era.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was thinking about when I was watching it is like, I wonder how many different places like have stories that didn't have someone like Mr. Matsura there.
That's right.
And of course, we're at a historical film festival. Can you just talk about the importance of documenting history, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I've made many, many historical documentaries. That's kind of been my wheelhouse for 47 years or something. And you don't often have a body of work like this to work from. I mean, except for the very beginning of the film where you see the pictures from Asakusa and Japan before Frank was born. Most of these, we're telling the story with his photos. And this community feels very strongly about this, that, they use his photos to document all kinds of stuff. They consider that body of work a really valuable asset, and that's why that historical society is just killing themselves trying to make sure that this stuff is preserved properly. So not every, as you say, not every community has it, and certainly not every community has the documentation of individuals the way this happened, and certainly Native communities, of course, will tell you that the body of work, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos of folks from the Colville Confederated Tribes, and that is hugely valuable. And people can, as Tilly Gore says, they can find their ancestors. I never imagined I would be able to make the connections with people that were made in this film. That I had this idea that there'd be a little device at the beginning of it where, that first shoot we did, where I'd say, had like a handful of people, and they would hold up their picture and say, "This is my great-granddaughter," right? Wow. That kept happening over and over and over again. People say, "Oh, yeah, no, that's Frank. I've got all kinds of pictures of him. That's my great-grandmother." I never imagined that. So it is really rare to have this kind of body of work.
Right.
It's so cool, too, this walking around Okanagan, you see the pictures on the walls. Like, they're just living with history right there. And Matsura's had such an impact and recorded that history. It's just a part of the community, the day-to-day community. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's really awesome. I think we've got a little bit more time if we want to open it up maybe to some people in the audience.
Cool. How did he get himself into his photographs?
He had a remote, a little cable. They don't show up in every single photo. And so, but I will also say, there are some of those photos where there's clearly another camera far away and someone else is taking, the cables aren't that long. Mm-hmm. So he's got other people in on the thing. But he's certainly traveled around with his big boxy Kodak Century and then other cameras so he could document himself documenting a thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's super meta.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I think we had a question here in the purple.
Did you find out who he was receiving postcards from? 'Cause I'm thinking he was 32 when he died, so were they from his mother?
Those were, it's an interesting thing that happened. One of the men in the film, Mr. Okami, who's talking about the diaries, his mother found out about Frank in a way that is very elaborate, but he found out about Frank, came to Okanagan, went to his grave, and realized that there was this connection, this family connection. So that woman, Fuku, brought the postcards. She came a couple of times and brought the postcards. They photocopied the postcards because it was many years ago. And the reason we even have that information is because she brought them back from Japan. Frank had some of this correspondence from them, and they had his correspondence, and we were able to amass a little collection of that correspondence. And so all those translations are from those postcards back and forth. To answer another piece of that, what you asked, it says on his grave that he's 32 years old. We're not sure why it says that, because he was actually 39 years old. And the grave was arranged by his friend, Judge Brown, who you would think would know how old Frank was. So we're not clear whether Frank was maybe not forthcoming about his age, or there was some mix-up at the, monument maker. But yeah, it's funny.
Great documentary, Beth, Scott, thanks for being here and sharing it with us. Everyone's going to take a different moment or image from that documentary home with them. There was one small moment that really touched me, and I thought because it's a documentary film festival, you could address it. You didn't wipe off the snow off of his gravestone. And I want to know the discipline it takes to do that,
Ruben,
which is what separates a photographer from a documentarian, and also how important that is to do that. And were you tempted to take it off, or to read his name, or was the poetic metaphor just irresistible?
So here's the story. A freak snowstorm happened while we were shooting. And I was like, oh my God, we're not going to get anything done. And the only thing I could think was, we're supposed to go up to the cemetery and film the grave. And you and Kevin were like, no, big, beautiful flakes. It's going to be great. Yeah. So we all went up, and, it was covered in snow, and just enough so you could see his name. Mm-hmm. And I had already thought that it would be nice to show the grave in several seasons, but I was like, yeah, should we wipe that off? And you said,
no, everyone, get back. It's like poetry. It's just like the snow and his name's kind of covered, but we can still see him, and he's coming through the years. He hasn't been forgotten. I'm like, just dig it.
We can't read his name. No.
Yeah, and Kevin's just like, whatever, dude. Can you hurry up? It's cold. Beth is rolling around. But I'm like, it's gold. So thank you.
That's good. That was good. Hey, can I just take a moment while we're talking about the people on the crew? Besides the wonderful Scott Ballard here, I want to have you stand up. Jordan Eusebio, who was not only the field recordist for sound, but also did the beautiful sound design for the film and the mix for the film. So thank you. And he came all the way from the Pacific Northwest for this, too, as well as our posse here. It takes a village to have an independent filmmaker finish a damn film. And that's part of the village right there. Will you guys stand up? This is my friend Pam, my friend Beth, and my friend Eric, who came from Vancouver, Washington to be here. So I just wanted to thank them.
That's awesome. I should also say I've lived in Savannah for about 10 years, but I was born in Vancouver, Washington. So
we heard about that. Is that your family there, right?
Yeah.
I found the cinematography really, really amazing. Like your use of negative space and everything. Like that shot when it's the sky and then we tilt down to the people sitting there. Like if you just talk about your experience filming it, I would love to hear more. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I spent a long time looking at his photographs to try to look at his landscapes and the liminal space that you used. And then, of course, as I spoke about, with the joy of the interviewees that we talked about and stuff. And so it really was just kind of trying to attach that poetry that he had of a time when we didn't have power lines and highways and things interfering with the frame. And so it's how can we mix in that juxtaposition of maybe a vibe of how he experienced Okanagan, how it is now, and let's marry those together in some way. And so just kind of looking at the poetry of each moment in the frames that we found and trying to find that. And I will say working with an amazing team, Beth, and amazing friends, Jordan, my friend Kevin, my friend Asia, who rightfully got the director of photography credit that you see.
Only because you went to SCAD.
Yep, blame SCAD. Is that we all speak the common language of that project, right? Beth is so wonderful of leading this project and explaining her vision to it so that we can decipher it. And working with amazing people and working with friends is that you get to share that. And so it feels like a unified whole. I watch it and I can't remember where I was and where Asia, it just blends together in this really beautiful way.
I also want to say that Scott and I have worked on several projects together, one which he is the director of photography on and is going to open at South by Southwest next week.
Nice. Congrats.
Different film, but very excited about it. And I met Scott, I think about 10 years ago now, and when I was doing a short that I've been wanting to do, and he said, I was trying to figure out where I was going to assemble a team because I mostly work with public television crews that are at the public television station. So this was I need a crew. And Scott was like, I got it. I got you. I know how to do. And those people not only were part of a group and a collective, really. Scott trained a lot of them. So if there's a seamlessness to it, it's also because Scott trained everybody, which is very cool. So I'm very grateful to you. And this is great to be here with you. This is so cool.
Amazing.
Well, thanks for sharing your film. And how about another round of applause?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.